Today we have Kellyanne Erdman joining us from Kelowna. So Kelly is a pretty incredible career herself, racing world championships in cycling, has a daughter who's a Canadian champion in the sprint triathlon. And Kelly is a registered dietitian with 25 years of experience working in performance-based sport with Cycling Canada and Skating Canada, athletics and cross-country Canada. So we're very excited to have her with us tonight and just share her wealth of knowledge and experience with everyone here. So I'll hand it over to Kellyanne and she'll go through her presentation. And then same as last week, we'll have a nice Q&A section at the end for everyone to just ask their questions. And that's always the most valuable part, I find. So I'll hand it over to you, Kellyanne.
Thanks so much, Tim. And thanks for helping to coordinate. How is that volume? Okay.
Yeah, it's great.
Awesome. Thanks everyone for joining us. I know it's busy when you're a triathlete and trying to put in all the workouts, and your nights are pretty precious, I realize. So we do appreciate that you were able to join us. I am going to cover quite a bit of content, and this is recorded. So we'll, I guess, get that to you somehow. Tim's got the magic touch on that piece. But awesome. So yes, thanks. I'm a registered dietitian and been practicing with athletes and working in sport for many decades, and Olympian in cycling, and moved to BC, as I was mentioning to Tim, about gosh, it's a year ago now. I'm trying to find my little advance. Yeah, so that's why I really wanted to study nutrition. I raced for Canada 1985 to 92. I was alternate in the road race and individual pursuit on the track. And I was just trying to think, what's my longest ride? Because you guys put in the hours. Well, gosh, it's all pre-pandemic, 2018. We did a 225K road to the sun, highly recommended, down in Montana. Took us 8 hours of cycling. That was amazing. That's my longest epic on the bike. And of course, then I had lots to eat. I wouldn't run a marathon. But I've also been to the Olympics as a dietitian. I was the team dietitian for Canada at the London Games. Here we are in 2012. And then I was also the dietitian at Sochi in Russia, 2014. We could just talk an hour on Sochi Olympics. But there was another dietitian that joined me. She was up in the mountains. So that was awesome. So yeah, I've been working with athletes for decades, and 7 Olympics with our women's hockey team, 5 golds, speed skating for 3 Olympics. And I continue to work with our men's para hockey team as they're decentralized coast to coast, literally. Oh, and now I'm working with women's golf. So that's a different endurance sport. Anyways, we're here to talk about fueling performances for you. And here's what I had planned. And thank you, folks, for submitting some questions in advance. It really helped to prep some of this content. We're going to go into just a quick overview on the nutrition intro, and then real specifics around preparing to train long workouts, endurance events, as well as competing, immediate race day or endurance day. What do you need throughout your endurance event, recovery, and then time for Q&A. And also, if there's time, we can talk supplements at the end. How does that sound? So write down your questions, save them, and we'll get to them at the end for sure. Okay, here we go on our intro, a bit of physiology, of course. And this graph illustrates the change in fuels that we use relative to exercise intensity. So on the bottom x-axis, we basically have exercise intensity as represented by the percent VO2 max. Your maximal effort over here is 100%, and 0 over here is sleeping. So sitting, moving, jogging, striding, tempo, full-on sprints as my cursor goes across to maximal efforts. So looking at that, what's happening in the change in fuels? Well, at lower intensity, you're using fat for fuel. That's not a surprise. So the crossover is around here, about just below 40% VO2, where we start to shift using more carbohydrate for energy. So at what intensity do you race at? What intensity do you train at? Because that is going to dictate in part what you're using for fuel. If you're doing a sprint, are you doing an Ironman? What's your distance? Because that's, of course, a factor. So the higher the intensity, the more you're burning pure carbohydrates. We'll talk about how that carbohydrate is available to you. But basically, I've got fat and carbs on the screen. We really prefer, our body prefers not to use protein for energy, but it can be used, and that will happen when we don't consume enough carbohydrates and you're working at a higher intensity. What about ketogenic diet? What about the idea of train low? Well, first of all, a ketogenic diet is a diet that's 75% fat and only 5% carbohydrate, 20% protein. So when you eat more fat, you do burn more fat for energy. But that being said, we'll talk about what is a limiting factor for performance with triathlon. Train low, what about that? The concept of training with no carbohydrate energy stores, and there are some benefits increasing mitochondria, getting a bit into the biochemistry, but only to be done when you exercise at a very low intensity. So carbohydrates, proteins, and fats, those are your fuel options. I guess we could say alcohol too, but let's look at carb, protein, fat as your macros, where you get energy from. And of course, starchy foods, gluten-free there, all your veg, all your fruits. The calories basically in those foods are mainly carbohydrate. The same with juices, yogurt, milk, soy yogurt, soy products. Legumes, lentils, yes, they have protein, but your legumes, like all the dried peas and beans, typically have about 3 parts carbohydrate to 1 part protein. So the greatest percentage of their calories are carbohydrate based. Proteins, vegetarians are going to have tofu and tempeh, maybe some of the dairy products, maybe, yes, getting some protein from legumes, nuts and nut butter. So I put a star, those guys, and cheese. Yes, they have protein, but guess what? They have more fat in terms of the energy distribution. So there we have it. That's probably review, I think, for most people. So carbohydrate is the main fuel for triathlon, as we'll talk about limiting factors with fatigue. Whether you have an apple or quinoa or pasta, sweet potato, whatever your carb, eventually it's glucose in the blood, and that's either direct fuel for the brain, central nervous system. Your brain is your control center. It tells you how to hold your form and hold onto the bars and swim well and run well and so on, decision making. We store carbohydrate in the liver. You store about 100 grams of carbohydrate. That's about 400 calories worth. And we also store carbohydrate in the muscle. The fitter you are, the more you store. Yeah, people store typically about 2 hours worth, up to 3 maybe, if you're super fit and have done some priming. But we don't store a lot. And you'll notice with the liver glycogen, that's 2 arrows there for a reason. We store liver glycogen, we convert it into glucose to keep our brain running. Muscle glycogen, energy that we eat, stored in the muscle, burnt in the muscle. And when you burn glycogen for energy, you produce lactate. So you know when you've got the burn happening, what your fuel is, right? At low intensity, you don't produce a lot of lactate because you're using more fat for energy, right? Excellent. So the main point here, central fatigue would be low glucose in the blood affecting your brain. Peripheral muscle fatigue is low glycogen. So what would be some signs if you weren't consuming enough fuel? Well, you might show up to train totally motivated, but you kind of look down at your muscles and it's an empty tank feeling, heavy, empty muscles. Or you might feel lightheaded, shaky, dizzy, People around you notice that you probably need to eat because you're hangry, which is now a word in the dictionary. Inconsistency with performances, definitely. With insufficient fueling, you might find that, why am I not building muscle? Why am I not getting stronger? Females, you start to see changes with your menses, either very light, short periods, or missing cycles. The hangry, not always feeling happy, depression, irritable, moody, problem sleeping, lack of sex drive could also be a factor. Difficulty to study or concentrate. So you might read something and you have to read it over and over. And then the immune system can be affected. So these are all signs of REDS, relative energy deficiency in sport. All right, what causes fatigue in your sport? Well, heart rate for one. How conditioned are you? How strong is your cardiovascular system? Build up lactate, lactic acid. Fitter you are, the more you can clear. Dehydration is going to be a limitation. Another limit is low blood sugar, also called bonking, hypoglycemia, low sugar, glucose in the blood, and then depleted, running out of energy stores, an empty gas tank. How many of these factors related to fatigue in your sport are nutrition related? There they are. Look at that. Yeah. So that being said, someone asked in one of our questions, what would be a good percentage for nutrition for you, for your macros, carb, protein, fat, if you're doing high volume? So I would look at this as someone that's putting in more than 10 quality hours a week of intensity. We would do higher carb, where like half your plate would be starchy foods, not just grains, but even starchy veg, quarter protein, a quarter veg. If you're not training as hard, percentage-wise, carbohydrate would be less, maybe a greater amount of fat and protein. With moderate training, this could be someone that's putting in, I would say, 6 to 10 hours a week. But it's also relative to a day. How hard did you train today? How much do you need today? So it's not even just the pure weekly, but even day by day. Easy training or trying to lose some body fat, then we would go half veg, maybe a quarter starchy foods, a quarter or more for protein. So if that helps you, but more specifically, we do like to calculate our macros in grams per kilogram. Body weight per day is much more precise than doing the percentages. And you know, that really should be a customized message relative to how much that you need. But this is just a framework to consider. I do want to spend a few minutes on keto because I have seen it with some triathletes using the ketogenic diet. And as I mentioned, it's a diet, it's not high protein, it's 75% fat. What is it? How does it work? Could it be helpful for athletes? So as we see, it's low carb. When people do this, they burn fat. When you eat higher fat, you burn higher fat for sure. Here's the rationale. So you end up using ketone bodies. That's why it's called ketosis or the ketogenic diet. You're trying to generate ketone bodies, which are used as a fuel for the brain, replacing glucose. It may help lower body fat if you're following this diet. Some people do lose weight on it. I've seen a lot of cases where people are losing muscle when they lose. Often it's used by people trying to manage irritable bowel syndrome, IBS. And then for some, it can really help to reduce craving carbohydrates and weight control. So pros and cons to it. First of all, the pros, as we mentioned, might help lower body fat. It can be good for blood sugar, blood glucose management, improves IBS. So if you're doing ultra distance, very slow, low intensity, submax efforts, and you follow a keto diet, you can go for long periods of time. But if your heart rate is high, again, you can't burn fat fast enough to keep you going. Physiologically, there is a benefit of keep the ketogenic diet with low intensity training to produce extra mitochondria. Mitochondria in your cells are basically helping to produce oxygen. That's where your VO2 comes from. Has been used therapeutically too with cystic fibrosis. Negatives to keto, risk losing muscle, lowers testosterone. I see changes with high cholesterol often. Can really be negative on the gut because the amount of saturated fat and risk of colon cancer, low fiber. Bottom line, as a triathlete, if you're doing intensity, the carbs will be too low. The other thing is, if you don't use it, you lose it. Your ability to store glycogen will be less over time. What we're saying, it down regulates your ability to store glycogen. You won't be able to store as much because you'll lose the enzymes necessary to build energy stores. Dyslipidemia, that means high cholesterol. It does contradict the diet to reduce systemic inflammation. That's Mediterranean. And the studies are not supportive for longevity. Oh yeah, being on a keto diet, it's like taking antibiotics, how it destroys the gut microbiota, the gut health. Your gut needs starch. Okay, let's get on into two triathlons. What to eat before, during, after training and racing. All right. Question for you. If you're planning to do a long workout, a brick session, long training on a Saturday or racing on a Saturday, this energy for Saturday comes mainly from what you ate on Friday, 24 hours before. Exactly. So what we want to talk about is how to prime for long workouts where you're going to be out there for more than 3 hours. Because remember, glycogen, you store for about 2 hours, right? Or it could be 3 if it's really low intensity. So we call this priming, preparing for long workouts or long races. 3 easy steps. The day before, at least 24 hours before. We would say that for females. Males could go up to 72 hours before. But increase your most concentrated carbohydrates. Those would be the starchy ones. So normally if you have a cup of rice, you'd increase that to 1.5 or 2 cups. And I would suggest to increase the amount of carbs or add a carbohydrate-rich bedtime snack. And then, of course, you'll need lots of water. I forgot to mention, every pound of glycogen attaches to 3 pounds of water. So you'll need to drink lots when you're eating higher carbs. But you would anyways, I'm sure. This works like a charm. I do this for myself. If I'm going for a long ride on a Saturday, I will make sure that Friday is not pizza night, but it's a good meal, carbohydrate rich. It really works well. So what we're trying to do, priming to compete or that long workout, build extra glycogen stores, priming, versus when you're just typically rested, you could, potentially get a good 2.5 or 3 hours of energy stores when you prime. If you want precise numbers, it would be 7 to 10 grams of carbohydrate for every kilogram that you weigh in the 24 hours before your long endurance event or race. And so I would use these for races that are going to be longer than a sprint. Depends on how fast your sprints are. The other consideration is when you count your warm up and the excitement of racing on, even for a sprint shorter event, you're going to be using up more fuel because of that excitement. So honestly, I would still prime for a sprint. So that would mean your plate's looking like the big one with a higher starch, the protein veg. Okay, what about, someone asked about nutrition when you have gut issues on race day? IBS, irritable bowel syndrome. It happens to a lot of people. It's not uncommon. So I've had success working with clients in regard to IBS, where we go low fiber, low residue in at least the 24 hours before you race. So, shy away from all the legumes and the fiber there. Instead of whole grain, whole wheat pasta, brown rice, we would go with the white stuff. So trying to reduce that fibrous, insoluble fiber in the system that can cause, contribute to IBS. Maybe I just said, eat lots of carbohydrates, but maybe more specific on the fruits, stay away from the tropical higher sugar fruits and more Canadian fruits. Well, BC's got a good source of Canadian fruits. Watch the juices, the dried fruits, a fiber there. Raw veg are going to be more of an issue with IBS, so make sure you're having cooked. And then another consideration is 24 hours before your endurance day, your race, maybe consider limiting lactose, the sugar in dairy products. You could do lactose-free dairy or just switch to other milk substitutes. Okay, we've done the priming. You've woken up. It's a day of your endurance race, your endurance training. So what to do? Well, most would be best to eat at least 2 or maybe 3 hours before your event starts. Diet as tolerated is my advice. Try not to change from what you know that works for you on a training day to a race day. Does protein work? Is fat what you like to include? Are you getting enough carbs? If you can't eat a lot, then maybe liquid choices there. And of course, water. What about caffeine? Peak absorption for coffee is about 45 to 60 minutes. Caffeine, though, can cause IBS. I should have had that on my last slide. But just be careful. A lot of people use caffeine to clear their system to help with digestion. And then, but keep that in mind. So we'll talk more about the pre-race nutrition, but question for you, which do we digest the quickest? Carbs, protein, or fat? Exactly, carbohydrates. Here it is. In terms of gastric emptying, the rate that food leaves your stomach, carbs are the quickest, protein slows it down, fats slow it the most. So that's where I was talking about what's the best for you. Do you want to show up on the line with an empty tummy and mostly go with carbohydrate rich pre-race? Or do you find that you perform better with consuming fat and protein, knowing these points that you'll have more sustained, slower released energy from those foods? So it's so individual as to what's the best, but just consider this is basically digestion. You're not going to fully digest. We're just talking about food leaving your tummy. Which is the best fit for you? A lot of people will do oatmeal. It's a great choice. If you want to shy away from the dairy on race day, make it with other milk substitutes or water. Would the fruit there be too much? And the fibrous almonds? I don't know. How about a bagel with peanut butter or almond butter and maybe some banana? That's a great one. A lot of people use that. Another one might be this egg burrito. So some scrambled eggs, roll it up. And then if another idea might be some French toast. You've got protein with the eggs, using maybe a milk substitute or lactose-free milk. And then the bread with a small amount of syrup. So like any of these would be great. How many of you have issues with no appetite on race day? Not uncommon. Keep it plain. Probably not going to want to have the plate of pasta for breakfast like this gentleman. Lots of fluids. So plain, I'm thinking, just a plain bagel, maybe white rice. Why not? That could be a good choice for you at breakfast. If you're not able to eat much in the morning with your pre-race, then at least once you get warming up, your tummy's going to settle, get rid of some of those nerves, and then most people find that they can start to snack a little bit before the race starts. Don't panic. You primed the day before, right? By eating more the day before, you've got energy in the muscles, and once you get going, you'll be able to eat after the swim. Okay, question for you. During a long workout, an endurance event, a race, triathlon race, nutritionally, which one of these do you not need? Is it protein, fluids, carbs, electrolytes? Well, I think that's a pretty easy question. You know it, protein. Okay, 3 things that you need with endurance, possibly. You all need fluids, maybe electrolytes. Who's a salty sweater? Who feels the salt on your skin? I am. Who's a cramper? Someone mentioned calf cramps. If you're having that situation with calf cramping during exercise, could be too low of sodium in the blood. That's the main mineral electrolyte that we sweat, that we lose in our sweat. If you're cramping outside of activity, outside and when you're not exercising, then it could be dehydration, could also be low sodium. If you're a cramper when you go to bed, that restless leg syndrome or muscle cramps, could be dehydration. I would do a calcium, magnesium at bedtime. That usually works pretty well for the bedtime cramping. Maybe carbohydrates, so fluids, carbs, possibly electrolytes, possibly. Let's break it down for each of these. Someone asked, how much fluid? Well, American College of Sport Medicine says 400 to 800 mils per hour. Your kidneys can only deal with 1 liter per hour. Some people will sweat and lose over 2 liters per hour. You don't want to drink that amount. I wouldn't drink more than 1 liter per hour. It's just going to pool in your body. You can't process it fast enough. That would be a good gauge. Electrolytes, sodium, at least 500 milligrams per hour, which is kind of like saying per liter. Please check your sport drink. In my next slide, you're going to see the variable amounts of electrolytes in different drinks. And if you know what a race organization is going to have at the feed station, then you can research in advance, knowing what that's like. For example, when I did the Grand Fondo one year in Penticton, and they had, I think they had Hammer products, and the sodium was quite low. So I brought Noon tablets in my jersey pocket so that I could have extra salt. I'm laughing because I don't know if have you ever chewed a Noon tablet? It's like foaming. I was frothing of the mouth because yeah, you just start, I had to drink a lot and just quickly chew it, but I was frothing. Okay, carbohydrates. I'm sorry, we'll get into my slide on electrolytes in a moment. Carbohydrates, when your race is longer than an hour, here's the guidelines. 1, 2, or 3 hours of race or endurance training, recommendation is between 30 to 60 grams carbohydrate for each hour. If you're going slower, lower intensity, you can go with a lesser amount. If you're going higher intensity in 1 to 3 hours, then you could go with the 60 grams. If your race or your training is more than 3 hours, we could bump it up as long as you have 2 different forms of carbohydrate, like glucose and fructose, and not just all glucose. 2 forms at least, 60 to 90. 90 is risky, I have to admit, that you still could have some gut issues. 60 is safe. So if you were looking at using 60 grams of carb per hour, that would basically be sipping on sport drink that has carbohydrate, plus eating a food item, 1 or 2 per hour. That'll give you 60 to 90. Like most bars have about 30, your gels are about 25 to 30. You could have a banana or some dates. The other point is, sometimes I find that people train at low intensity, eat at low intensity, and then they go to race at a higher intensity, and all of a sudden they have gut problems. And it's because they didn't train their gut to eat during high intensity. You got to train yourself to eat at race pace. And the reason for that, the higher the intensity that you train, and race, the less blood flow to the gut. So the food's going to pool in the gut. It's called ischemia, lack of blood flow to the gut. The blood is all in your muscles, away from the gut, and the food is going to cause issues there. So the higher the intensity, the less the blood flow to your tummy, digestive system, and that's going to cause problems. So do train your gut to eat during intensity, not just eat with low intensity. They're two different things. Oh, here's a homemade sport drink recipe for you I put together. This one is a liter of either water, or you could use like a herbal tea of your choice, like even a ginger tea or lemon tea. Most of us prefer the tart lemon flavors during exercise versus sweet. So using lime or lemon, about 60 mils, a quarter cup. And then if you want carbohydrate in your sport drink, berry sugar, which is nice. It's a finer sugar than granulated. And that would be the 3 to 4 tablespoons. And then add your salt. So add a quarter teaspoon. There it is, 600 milligrams of sodium, some carbohydrates because of the sugar if you're going to add it. And this works great for, your own use. Other endurance foods, some I've mentioned: dates, dried apricots, banana, my bonkwich. Okay, so when I used to bike race, I just got so sick of bars. I would just take a piece of bread, white bread if you want to digest it quicker, right? A layer of butter, and then, or peanut butter. It's a bit sticky though and dry. And then I would usually put butter and then either some honey or jam and fold it in half. There's my bonkwich. So that worked well. Gels, chews, feed zone portables, you can make your own. And then, as I mentioned, gluten-free, a lot of these are. You'd have to check the starch in some of the different gels and chews. That could be an issue on the gluten-free piece if they don't say that it's cornstarch. Well, I just wanted to add a couple slides. If you're interested to explore around, what is your sweat rate in different conditions? Of course, I went for a little bike ride today here in Kelowna. It was, I think, 9 degrees. Yeah, I sweat. I was climbing, but wouldn't be the same as 39 degrees in July. 3 things you need to know if you're going to calculate your sweat rate. Do you know what they are? How much weight do you lose during exercise? So right before, right after. What did you drink by volume? How long are you out there? 3 things. So let's show you an examples of how this is done. Best to use kilograms for body weight because it works so nicely with the calculation. How much weight did you lose? Check yourself with minimal clothing, stripped down. Your clothes hold a lot of water weight. Use the same scale. Don't move your scale. What did you weigh? Even if you voided, had a little pee break, still check your weight. I mean, what I meant to say is even if you go to the bathroom while you're exercising, still check your body weight. What did you drink in liters versus milliliters? How much time in hours? Okay, a kilogram of body weight lost is a liter of sweat, basically. The weight that you lose during exercise mainly reflects what you've lost as sweat weight. Some you lose when you're talking and breathing, but not a lot. Here's my example. Someone is 71 kilos, 150 pounds, and they finished and they're at 70. That's so easy. They lost a kilogram. That means they've lost a liter. It's a direct 1-to-1. In this case, they drank 1.5 liters and they were out there. So we add those together. I'm sorry. A liter for the kilogram lost plus 1.5 for what you drank divided by, in this case, 3 hours. And that works out to, for that workout, that intensity, that terrain, that humidity and temperature, that was a sweat rate for this person with all those considerations. It just helps to know. That's 833 mils per hour. just less than a liter. On average, people lose, they're said to be 1.2 liters per hour is the average. But again, I've seen some people lose over 2 liters in an hour. Now, let's say this person, my example, lost just under a liter, 0.833 liters in that hour. That doesn't mean that you need to drink the amount that you've lost. If you figure out your sweat rate, you should drink about 50%. You wouldn't want to match it. And you should definitely not gain weight when you finish your exercise, because that's going to mean you either overdrank, or it could also mean low sodium and you're in a situation called hyponatremia, low sodium in the blood, and there's water weight gain with it. You mainly want to avoid losing more than about 3% of your body weight. Okay, moving on, the final section is what to eat after exercise. We usually say these are the 5 R's: restore energy. The considerations: repair muscle, rehydrate, replenish electrolytes, and for timing, let's think of that real fast. So get to food right away within 30 minutes. There's 2 parts to recovery. But of course, this is critical mostly on your training days. If you finish your triathlon, you probably aren't going to be doing much the next day. So this really applies more to the training. And on a race day, you might just say, I'm just going to celebrate and not worry about it, but more so on the training. So my question to you, if I said, I'm sorry, you can only choose one item from these 4, which would be the one choice that would be the best choice? I want you to think about this. What is your body's priority in recovery? Each of these offers something different. Start with the almonds. High fat, some protein, not much carb. Coconut water, liquid there, potassium, not much salt, sodium, or carbohydrate. Granola bar, carbohydrate, not much protein, no liquid, a little bit of salt, sodium. And then in the whey, protein, very little carbohydrate, might be some sodium. You got it. Your body's priority for recovery is restore glycogen, restore energy, carbohydrates. So if you used whey for recovery by itself, it's mainly protein, and you mix it with water, your body's going to say, well, thank you, but I'm going to have to use some of this protein to try to restore energy, and not as much will be available for the protein needs. Luckily, you don't need to decide, and you can do them all. Here's my comment to share with you a study where they looked at this group of athletes, and this is in regards to the timing of when the athletes ate after exercise. They had this group of athletes, they did a workout, and then immediately gave them the amount of nutrition that they needed to restore energy, glycogen, carbohydrate reserves. They fed them within 30 minutes. And then another day, and I'm sorry, this is the glycogen that appears in their muscle the next day, because right after training, they ate. Same group of athletes in the second part of the study, they did the same workout, they ate the same amount of food. But what they did in the second part of the study, they said, I'm sorry, you now have to wait for 2 hours after exercise before you can eat. They did that, and then they measured the energy in their muscles 24 hours later, and it was a significantly lower. Of course, that's what we're seeing with the blue bars. So this is the stored energy. The next day, when the athletes didn't get to their food quick enough, and this is all to do with enzymes in the muscles that are most ready to restore energy within the first 30 minutes to 2 hours after training. So even though they ate the same amount, sorry, enzymes have gone to sleep. They said, I guess we're not needed, off we go. So folks, there's 2 stages to recovery. If you train in the morning, 7:30 to 10, the stage 1 would be, I say within 30 minutes since your last effort. So if you're doing a big cool down, you're already into that recovery mode. It's relative to your heart rate. As soon as your heart rate starts to come down, put your watch on, because now you got 30 minutes. When I worked with speed skaters in Calgary, we would have them there on the bikes, cooling down, already getting into their shakes and recovery food, because they'll be training that afternoon. And then the meal to follow. So try to get to within your meal within 2 hours since you finished training. Can you bring some immediate recovery foods or buy some? At least a couple of items. Maybe it's fruit, dried fruit. Is it a bar? I'm sorry, there's no carbohydrate in the water here. It could be a shake, a smoothie, some baked item. Yeah, you could stop at Timmy's. You can get something there. Right. And then let's not forget protein. And again, in the recovery, looking at a good 15 to 20 grams of protein. The amount of carbohydrate for most people, it ranges 0.8 to 1.2 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram body weight within the immediate recovery and the meal, both. So again, we can, if you're interested, some of us work together individually. I can help you out to calculate that kind of stuff. Let's not forget the protein. If you train late at night and you want to have immediate recovery and then get to your meal, knowing that you're going to have a lot of protein in the meal, you could skip this in that immediate recovery, but I wouldn't skip the carbohydrate. So at least have a piece of fruit and then get to your dinner meal. And if you eat that meal sooner than later, that's better. Don't wait till late, like an hour and a half. The sooner is better. Because I know some of you are going to be training at night. And yeah, that's how I would manage that timing. In your recovery meal, how hard did you work? How depleted are your muscles? How much fuel have you used? So you decide 1, 2, or 3/5 of your starch. So basically that would give you 0.8 to 1.2 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram body weight. And also getting some carbs from your veg, from your protein. If you're eating as a vegetarian, that would typically translate to, most people are going to go with about 90 to 180 grams of, say, tofu, or a cup of legumes. That would be a cup of, say, Greek yogurt or cottage cheese. And for eggs, most people are going to need at least 3 eggs. Maybe you could do a couple of eggs and then extra protein from whites, egg whites. Oh, there was a question. What about where does alcohol fit? Well, in recovery, of course, you could have a beverage, enjoy. Of course, though, what are the challenges with alcohol? It's dehydrating. Your liver has to process that, and your liver is involved in helping to restore glycogen. So do be careful. And it's okay to have a beverage, but not while you're neglecting your rest of your nutrition. Thanks for asking. Red Truck, that's BC beer. Awesome. So there we have it. Nutrition before, during, after. Questions or comments?